Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is episode number 2 of It's in the Tune. So this car today is something by a guy named Jonathan out in South Carolina, and this is a really interesting story. So basically he's got an Ex Highway Patrol car, it's an 89, and he's done some pretty extensive modifications. It's now a 408 stroker, 351 based motor, big AFR 205 heads. He's got a custom Ed Curtis cam, Tremec T-56 Magnum. It really looks like a killer build, to be honest. But here's kind of the scenario. He said, a while back I took it to a guy to do a dyno tune locally, and we had a lot of really strange issues as we were going through that process, and we just couldn't figure out why it wasn't responding to changes in the QuarterHorse and doing things the way we expected. Well, ultimately what they ended up figuring out was that the QuarterHorse chip itself was bad. He said they got some additional hardware and kind of confirmed that was the case, and essentially it was just throwing its tune away after a few minutes. Never seen a QuarterHorse do that. I don't think that's a real common problem, but whatever, he ended up getting a new one. And so basically it sounds like once he did that, he never really picked back up where they left off. They never quite finished the tune, and it's just not running right. It's just, there's a lot of issues with it. The timing's not quite right. And then there's some other issues that it was going lean a lot and things like that. And so the first thing I did is, I said, well, send me some info, send me the data logs, send me your tune, let me take a look and see where we're at. And I got a lot of different logs. So, first thing I look at when I look at a log is, do I have any wide open throttle stuff in there? That's the biggest part of what I want to see, because that's where you're really going to do damage if something's wrong. So this is kind of zoomed in on a log, and I want to show you what really, really stood out to me and makes it crystal clear why we need to change this. So if you look at this part right here, this red line is the throttle. So you could see basically somebody was kind of hanging out and they rolled into it, and then they're flat, wide open throttle for about 3 seconds. And during that process, you can see that the RPMs are climbing. So this is a pull from about 2,500 RPMs to about 4,400. So nothing crazy, but a short wide open throttle pull. And what jumped out at me is when I was looking at the load throughout that period. And you notice that even though this is at wide open throttle, the load is anywhere from maybe 43, looks like it gets up to about 52 or 53. The load with this combo should be substantially higher. If it's not, 80, 90, 100 kind of all through this range, I couldn't imagine why that would be the case. It's definitely in the tune. And your load measurement comes directly as a result of understanding your cubic inches that you plug into the tune for your motor and your mass air reading. And so knowing that this is a 408 car, the very first thing I assumed is that somebody probably left it in the tune as a 302 cubic inch. And when you do that, the load will be off dramatically by a factor of, whatever the difference is between your actual cubic inches and what the computer thinks you have. So that was kind of the first thing I suspected. And then also, Jonathan's using a mass air meter that I've actually never seen used on a Fox body. It's a VMP 3500, where he's also got the wire for the intake temp, tightened up and put into his computer, rather than the factory air charge temperature sensor. So I kind of talked about that in another video. That's another thing that we'll have to consider when we get into this. And then there's some scaling that VMP provides, because that was really designed for a later car, and the different EECs have a hard limit on the maximum kilograms per hour airflow that you can have, that the computer can register. And it was a little bit higher with the old EEC4s. It's lower with the EEC5, and that's kind of what this mass air I think was designed for. So the tables that VMP provided at our request, they're actually scaled down by a factor of 0.59. So whatever the actual airflow value really is, the table they gave us is scaled down to 59% of that value. So we're going to have to scale that back up. So, but again, this is kind of what I saw. I'm thinking somebody's probably messed with the injectors and don't have the right injector data. The cubic inches are probably off, and the mass airflow has probably been manipulated to get the fuel where it needs to be, but ultimately is not reporting the correct load, and that's exactly the case. And you can tell here, if you look at the air-to-fuel ratio that's being achieved versus the LAMZ being requested, I mean, they are almost spot on. So I can tell you, the tuner that was on the dyno, they did a good job as far as getting the mass air to be hacked in a way that gave you good fuel ratio, air-to-fuel ratio, but it's not the right way. And your timing is going to be way off as a result of all this stuff, because if you look over here, so here's where you're actually at idle, and you're really not doing anything, you're just kind of cruising and really light cruise almost completely off the throttle, and look at the load measurement all through here. 5, 6, 5, 6, 7, you know, even with a little bit of a throttle push here, it only goes up to 10. You're living in the very, very bottom rows of your fuel and your spark, and unless that stuff has been changed to account for this, this is really kind of a spelling disaster. Your timing is going to be not where you want it to be. So all that stuff being said, what we're going to do now is jump over to the tune. I'm going to point out just a couple quick things that I see as problematic, and then we'll go from there. First things first, when I've got the tune loaded up here, I'm going to go down to this System tab and go to these scalars. And this is where you can see the cubic inches of the motor, and it's still sitting at 302. So this has been unchanged. So that's the first thing we'll want to do, is this definitely needs to be set at 408. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is the injectors. So Jonathan said he's got the old, you know, the green 42-pound Ford injectors, like the old Lightning type EV1 fat body injectors. So let's go take a look at the fuel, and let's go see where the injector slopes are. So you could tell these are not accurate at all. This is actually these numbers are smaller than stock. So again, this is further proof that things have been manipulated in the mass air curve and the cubic inches to try to fudge these numbers and make this make sense. But this is all going to report the wrong load. So this is not what we want to do. So I'm going to jump out to EFI dyno tuning, and I've got that injector data loaded up here. And this is at least a good start. Now, this number that we're using, this is based on 39 pounds fuel pressure. So Jonathan, if you're not using 39 pounds, I think we should probably go ahead and turn you back down. You've got an adjustable regulator. Let's get you back at 39. And of course, you check that with the vacuum line disconnected on the pressure regulator while you're doing it. Of course, plug it back in when you're done. So we're going to go ahead and plug these numbers in. So high slope is going to be 43. And the low slope is going to be 46.06. Okay, so that's fine there. Then we're going to look at the break point. And the break point that we have for these injectors is 212. So I'm going to make that change here across the board. Okay, so that gives us our break point, and then let's go check our voltage offset table, or function, excuse me. So we'll leave that top row alone, but then we'll have 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 8, 6, and zeros the rest of the way down. And then up here, just plug these guys in. All right, so we've got that data in. This is, again, nothing's ever perfect, but this is a much better starting point. So we've got good injector data for your offset break point, high and low slope. We have changed your cubic inches. Now let's go look at your mass air curve and see what's going on there. So mass air transfer, and we'll go ahead and pull this back up full size. So, you know, and not to say this is a problem, but you can kind of further see that this mass air transfer has been kind of manipulated. It's not a smooth curve anymore, so certainly somebody has gone in here and made adjustments. It's never truly, you know, a perfect curve after it's been tuned, so I get that. But, you know, this is further evidence that somebody's had to probably, you know, work through this to try to compensate for other things. And the only thing I'm really looking at right now is, where does this max out? This is maxing out at 1,100 kilograms per hour. This is definitely not accurate to that mass air meter. So if we jump over here, this is the transfer sheet that VMP provided. And this is based on, again, that particular slot style sensor that goes into the tubing. Jonathan has a custom 4-inch tube that he's put together for all this stuff. So this is all based on a 4-inch tube. And you can see that this transfer function gives us volts and kilograms per hour. And you can see this goes all the way up to 1,700. Now, this is also scaled down, as I mentioned earlier, by a factor here. So what I'm going to do is take all these kilogram per hour numbers and divide them by 0.59 to get the actual numbers. And then I'm going to use this data for our curve. So let's go grab all of this and paste that in here. And let me double check, and I didn't see how many rows there were. So this goes down to 19.643. The only problem is that we will need one additional row to get us up to this, basically your 5-volt value, but to go up above that. I don't think we're going to get up into this. So honestly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, just chop the top row off here and let it just stop and make this number the same. So 2830, I'm going to put 2830 there also. And I'm going to start grabbing the voltage from this cell down and paste all those numbers in. And because you always have to leave your top row at this factory setting of maxed out, basically 16 volts, because if for some reason there's a failure in your electrical system and you see a little bit of a voltage spike, you don't want anything to freak out at you. So that's why you always leave that top row alone, and you always need the bottom one to still be a 0. Okay, so this is going to be our mass air transfer we're going to start with. Now, the EEC4 has a limitation. If we actually manage to get up into this area, your computer's going to hit a wall. It can't understand values above around 2300. I think it's 2350 kilograms an hour. And there's ways to trick the computer if you're actually achieving that. I know you've got a 408. I know you've got big heads and a decent sized custom cam. We'll see. I don't think you're going to get up this high. You might. I do think you're probably going to get somewhere in this range right here. But we're going to find out. I know in that log where you stopped your pull at about 4300, it looked like you got to about 3.2 volts on here. So I know you're probably going to take this up a little past 6 based on your cam, but you know, we'll find out. So that's your mass air transfer. That looks a lot better. Now, the next thing we're going to have to do, and this is up to you, you're going to have to do this after the fact. You're going to have to log something for me once we kind of get the fuel and timing dialed in, and do not do this until we get the fuel and timing dialed in. But what I want you to do is do a wide open throttle pull starting at like 2000 RPMs and take it all the way up to red line. Again, after we get the fuel and spark dialed in. And what you're going to have to do is take a look at what the load measurement is, and you're going to need to put that stuff right here in this function. So basically, we're going to plot what your maximum load is that you achieve at these given RPMs. We can even fudge these a little bit. We'll want to have a value in here that matches wherever your peak torque is, wherever the load starts to drop back off, which is a normal thing that happens, as you can see like in the factory curve here. But this is something that we'll want to do. And again, this hasn't been manipulated either. So if the tuner had chosen to leave those injector sizes kind of where they were as a starting point, like factory setup, fudge the cubic inches and do everything with the math, well, once they got the fuel right, what they really needed to do is go back and do what I'm asking you to do here to adjust this load so that it measures actual whatever crazy numbers they come up with that are artificially low, but fine, plot that, put it in here. And then once you do that, then you can go rely on your open loop fuel table to be more accurate, because if this is dialed in, then your per load is going to stay right at 100 naturally aspirated pretty much across the entire RPM range. And so if we go look at your open loop table now, let's see what they've done there. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I can kind of see how they did anticipate that change in load, so they've definitely manipulated this. I'm going to throw up a comparison here to put this up next to a stock open loop table. And what I'm seeing here is that these cells have been manipulated by this tuner, which is something they actually needed to do, or else you would have run really lean. But because your load is artificially low, that means your per load is also artificially low, because that load scaling table hasn't been changed. So if we go back to your chart for a minute, let me pull up load X, see if that was logged here. Okay, so even the load X you can see peaks out at about 64 right here, but down here it's like 56, 55, 54. So again, further evidence that things are not right. So factory computer assumed wide open throttle, you were going to stay right at around 100 load X or per load, which would have you running out of this top cell. But you're actually only achieving like around here. So you're kind of living in this area. And what they've done is they've brought these numbers at this row, they brought them way down, so they're getting more into an acceptable wide open throttle fueling. And then here they've kind of kept it sort of the same. So this is really strange, though. This isn't going to jive for me. I'm going to put all of this back to factory specs for now, and then just make a couple simple changes. Because with all this said and done, your loads and your per loads should be about right. So I'm going to leave that there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to richen this up. And this is probably going to go richer than this still, but I am going to put it for now at 12.6 in this top row and lock all of this out. And we'll do it right there also. So this will give us kind of a nice area to work with to keep the fueling kind of consistent while we're trying to get that dialed in and work on your mass air transfer. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I like to keep these cells down here at a true 14.64. It's easier to dial in your fuel, and this is what the engine is probably going to want anyways. So we'll kind of start there, and I'm going to leave the rest of it alone. And any tuner worth their salt here, if they go messing with especially these colder areas down here in the open loop table, you know, what I see a lot of tuners do is they'll put like most of this table in these bottom cells all to 14.64, which theoretically is fine, but if you do that, you have to modify your startup tables appropriately, because you're essentially asking it to be richer throughout several of these cells if you were to drop that down. And then you need to mess with this table, and this tuner has messed with your startup table considerably, so it looks like they basically lowered down a lot of these numbers from what they were stock, and you know, that might be okay. But since we're going back to stock style, more or less, we're going to change that, and we're going to go back to stock here as well. So we might fine tune this later, but that'll get that for us for now. Now, another thing that Jonathan mentioned was that he wanted to make sure he had closed loop. He said the previous tuner had forced open loop, and he'd like to get back to using the oxygen sensors and closed loop. He still has both factory O2 sensors in place. He said he added a wideband into an additional bung on the passenger side, and so we still have both sensors to work with. Now, Jonathan, one thing I'll tell you right now, and this is just my experience, every engine's different, yours could be totally different than this, but pretty much every single small block Ford I've tuned with the QuarterHorse and looked at the O2 sensor readings from the factory and the fuel trims, the driver's side has always been leaner than the passenger side. And so when I think about where I want to put my wideband, if I know that one side runs a hair leaner, the safer thing to do is probably to put it over on the other side. But honestly, your bung's already in there. I wouldn't mess with it. It's wired up, it's working, it's fine. But just keep that in mind that as we're tuning based on your air to fuel ratio up top and using that wideband as our tuning tool, we might actually try to tune it so that it looks just a hair richer. Like if we're saying, as an example, if we want to hit 13.0 as our air to fuel, I might actually do that so we're hitting something more like 12.8, just down a hair, because that's probably what we're going to see. But we'll also see this once we turn on your open loop and we start capturing adaptives and we go through that process. We might find the data tells us if one side's leaner than the other by about what percent. We know how to make some decisions. So we'll leave all that stuff alone for now. Let's go get that. Let's go get open loop functional again. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go down here to open loop, go to the scalars, and we're going to say allow closed loop, which is going to turn on a bunch of other stuff for us. So that's done. Then we're going to go up to adaptive learning. And we need to turn on adaptive control also. So we're going to make that enabled. So that brings, again, a bunch of other settings up to us. I'm going to go ahead and make a minor change here to give us a bigger range of fuel trim adjustment that the computer will allow while it's doing this adaptive learning. So basically up to an additional 25% fuel addition or a cut as it sees fit. Ultimately, this won't really matter in the long run, but for now, we're going to do that. And then let's go look and make sure that the adaptive update table has not been hacked. Okay, so this has been left alone. This is all stock. The scaling, you know, all the columns and all the row values are the same. So the only change I'm going to make here is I like to bring these guys down. This is something Decipha does in his tunes. I like it. Gets things to learn a little bit quicker down here. So other than that, we'll leave the rest of it alone for now. I'll bring these down a hair also. But that's the only change I want to make right now. And we'll leave this table alone. We'll see how it does. And let's also go check the special idle and just make sure that on the special idle cells, those haven't been jacked with. So back up to our scalars. Okay, yep, so special idle cells, all that stuff's been left alone. So we're going to let that go. Okay, so adaptive learning looks good there. Let's confirm that they've left this alone in your tune, where you're going to have both sensors still turned on. So we go to O2 HEGOs, go to these scalars, and okay, number of sensors is still at 2, so that looks good. Then what we need to do is look at the injector output port. Okay, and make sure that's still set up. So this is still calibrated like it is from the factory to allow for both oxygen sensors and to read left and right banks independently. So that looks good. And then the last thing I'm going to do is make sure that the cam ref reset is not hasn't been messed with. And that's set to normal. Okay, so that looks good. So now, theoretically, with this tune, adaptive learning should be turned on, should learn something. It should give us some good data to work with as we're getting your car kind of settled back in with this new tune, because we're almost starting from scratch here, so inevitably fuel's going to be off, everything's going to need some help. So that looks good there. And let's go look at one more thing under fuel. Let's look at the cranking fuel, which I forgot to look at earlier, and see if that makes sense. Okay, so factory stuff with 19-pound injectors. These are your milliseconds that the injector is going to stay open during cranking. This is a lot different here because you've got 42-pound injectors. So this actually, I've seen these numbers before. I, for some reason, keep seeing these in a tune. I don't know if this is an A9L2 thing or something else, but this data might be a little bit stout. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy back in all the factory specs, and then I'm going to multiply this by like 0.6. I mean, your injectors are a little bit more than twice as big, but you also probably need a little bit more fueling than stock. So let's maybe do like something like 0.65. We'll have to see if you have a hard time starting your car when it's cold, medium temp, or hot. Let's pay attention to that. If you have a hard time getting it to catch and turn over, then we might need to mess with this a little bit more. Okay, so that all looks good there. Okay, so now that we've got the crank fuel sorted out, at least we think we do, we're going to take a look at the injector timing and a couple last little modifiers for fueling, and we can jump over to idle and spark. So under the injector timing category here, let's take a look. So basically this is a stock table still minus this bottom area down here, and I am really not sure why this was changed this way. This doesn't really make any sense. I mean, some of the Decipher stuff that he has, he'll say just put the whole table at 500. That's sort of what's happened here, but they didn't do the whole table. This isn't really particularly logical. So what I'm going to do as a starting point, I'm going to put the entire stock table back. And then what I'm going to do is take the entire table, because this is a big stroker motor, bigger cam. We'll get more specific on this after some more tune revisions, but I'm going to multiply this entire table by, let's do it by 20%. So basically adding an additional 20%. And then I'm going to shave just a little bit off of this very top end right here. So I'm going to plug these guys in at 524, and then I'm going to interpolate everything across this range horizontally and kind of smooth that out. So not perfect, but this is probably a more reasonable starting point for this part. And then down here at these bottom cells, I'm also going to bring these down a hair. So let's bring that up, and again, then we'll interpolate across here horizontally, and that should be a pretty smooth curve. Let's just take one quick look here, kind of see where we're at. So yeah, there's a little bit of a dip through this area, so let's smooth that out just a hair. Let's bring that down to 496. Let's bring this down to 490, just a touch. Let's bring this up just a touch here, and let's bring this up to let's do like 476. Okay, so that should be a good starting point, but again, we'll do a better job of this later. Okay, so cranking fuel sorted out, injector timing is good enough for now. Nothing going on that's changed here. Okay, let's take a look at some of these modifiers. Let's take a look at the watt fuel multiplier. So I'm just not a big fan of this at all. So what I'm going to do, it looks like in the tune they took some of these low RPMs and kind of negated the effect there from the factory tune. I'm going to put this at all ones because again we're going to tune things much better using open loop, getting your perload dialed in, all that stuff. So I'm really not concerned about that being all set to 1. So this will be a lot easier to tune your fuel also, because with this stuff in place on a wide open throttle pull, your lambsies are constantly fluctuating, and it's a little harder to get a good read anyways. So this is just a better way to dial things in there. So I'm good with that. We'll see if there's any of these others that have been messed with. Looks good there. Okay, transient fuel stuff has not been messed with, so that looks okay. And none of that's been messed with. So I think in general this fueling is good enough for now. So okay, we're going to move on. Let's go take a look at idle and see if anything crazy's happened. So first thing at idle I'm always curious about is just what are the idle RPMs set to. Now this is again a big 408 stroker, big heads, pretty big cam, and I'm actually surprised. I see so many tuners just make a massive RPM increase here for whatever reason. And Ed's cams are known to be very, very good and have good street manners. So I don't know if this is a suitable RPM or not, but what I'm going to do is make an assumption that this is okay. And let's see what the math says. So 816 minus the factory's 672 is 144. So to properly change this to, in my opinion, as you've seen in some other videos, we also need to bring a few of these other properties up by a similar amount. So we're going to have to bring this guy up the same amount, and then when we jump over here, there's a couple more properties. Okay, so this one has been changed, although it's not, well, I guess with rounding that probably is about right, but I'll just kind of do it again to make sure. So 968 there, that's up by 150, so that all looks pretty sound. So I think those are going to be okay, and the only other thing that's been messed with is this. This is pretty minor stuff. This is just an extra RPM kicker when when you first start up. So a few RPM difference, not a big deal there. Okay, now another thing that I want to check when it comes to raising up your idle RPM is seeing if any of these other tables have been messed with, where like your gain multiplier and things like that. So okay. This is really common, something people don't do. You have to adjust this stuff in relation to where your new target idle RPM is going to be, because it has more gain with the idle air valve trying to control and maintain steady state. When you're falling short and your RPMs are going down, or when you overshoot and it's trying to pull things back down, and this is going to be really kind of jacked up if we don't sort that out. So I'm going to raise this by the same number of RPMs. And that should keep the idle air valve from doing anything super weird, just during kind of normal idle scenarios. So let's kind of take a quick look. Okay, none of that's been messed with. That's all left alone. Okay, we'll come back to idle air in just a second. Okay, that's been left alone. ISC crank duty cycle. I'll leave that alone for now. Without some data logs and knowing if we're having start issues, I don't know that I can confidently make any changes there, so I'll leave that be. This is also weird. So you can see the tuner here at very low RPMs. They're having a much larger idle air valve air addition to try to keep the car from stalling. But honestly, this is a poor way to compensate. What really needs to happen is these RPMs just need to shift up again according to how much higher we're trying to run our new target idle speed. So I'm going to bring those up by 144 RPMs. And then what I'm going to do here is put these values back, and then just make kind of a minor modification here to multiply these and add 25% in. And that's probably a much smoother way to handle that. So I think that'll be good. Rest of those have been left alone, so that looks good. Now, one last thing I noticed here on idle that jumped out at me is this idle throttle body airflow has been altered. Now, this is one of those things that the only way we can alter this is based on where you've got your throttle blades stop screw adjusted, and what your engine wants. This is a stroker motor. It's a 351 based engine, so there's going to be a lot of differences here. At this point, without more data, with kind of this refreshed version of the tune we're getting into, I don't know where to set this. So we'll have to get some logs. We'll do a revision on this, but this is going to have to be altered, as is the neutral idle air. and the drive idle air. And just looking at this, this can't possibly be right. I mean, basically, this is less air than stock. And this is basically a parameter that says, you know, for this engine to maintain its RPMs when at a desired RPM, how much air does the engine need? Your stroker motor certainly does not need less air than a bone stock 302 with E7 heads. So if nothing else, what we're going to do for starters is add in the factory's tables here. Zero this out. We'll leave all this alone. But I suspect, honestly, again, we're going to have to raise these numbers up. How far, I can't tell you yet. We'll figure that out. But this is a bit odd. And then let's go look at the drive idle air. Okay, and then this was left alone. So we'll go ahead and leave that alone for now. We'll just kind of leave all this running with stock settings. But I guarantee you're going to need to raise this in some way. But we're going to need some data to work with to do that. So, okay, so we're going to leave all that stuff alone. And now let's look at your idle spark. So spark versus RPM. So the first thing I notice is they've cut you back a few degrees for your idle spark, which as long as your base timing is set at 10 degrees with the spout out, just kind of normal operation, this is definitely, I would be surprised at your engine being happy with those AFR heads, which are very, very efficient, and having this little amount of timing. This modifier's not been messed with. And they haven't done anything in these neutral, nothing substantial anyways, in this neutral RPM error function to get us anywhere different. I mean, this is basically stock. So you really are just kind of running right now with less timing. Yeah, I'm going to, and you're not running a lot of compression. You said you're running about 9.5 to 1 compression. So at that compression with those efficient heads, I can't imagine this engine being real happy on this little amount of timing. So I'm going to at least bump this back up to factory spec here. And really, this doesn't matter. Your engine shouldn't be down here, but I'll leave that alone. That's probably not going to hurt us either way. So, okay, so we'll leave all that alone. So that's pretty much idle handled. Now, kind of the final thing I want to look at is your normal spark and your rev limiter. So rev limiter hasn't been messed with. I'm going to leave that alone. And let's take a look at how the spark's been configured. So they've got this set up for sea level only, which should be just fine. You're at a very low altitude, so that's probably just fine. Still has wide open throttle spark, so let's go take a look at that table. Okay, so your timing curve here, you've got 30 degrees total. It's all in at 3,500 RPMs. You know, that's probably not terrible. Now, I will say that I would encourage us to kill all of this and not use the wide open throttle table, turn that off so we can run exclusively off the sea level table, and we'll have a lot more adjustment. But this is also going to require us to rescale this table to open up some additional RPMs and probably some higher loads that we'll want to get into. I'm going to save that for a round 2 revision. Let's see if we can just generally get the fuel with the new injectors, the new mass air curve, and just kind of generally get things happy. But this is something I definitely want to change. I want to turn off your wide open throttle and control it over here. We're going to have a lot more flexibility to do that. So I'll leave that timing table alone. The base and sea level have been left stock. That's fine for now. This hasn't been messed with. None of these others have been messed with. That's just kind of looking at our idle again, so that's fine. Subtractors, multipliers, not a big deal. And we'll see if any of these adders have been tampered with. So, okay, so here's one thing that's been changed is wide open throttle advance versus BP. This is actually probably a good change. I don't think you're going to be moving around too much with barometric pressure because, again, you're kind of staying sea level, staying pretty flat. This probably won't be a noticeable change anyways. I'm sure you're going to be in this working range all the time. But just in case you find yourself in with this lower pressure, then at least this isn't going to pump a bunch of extra timing on you for now. So I'm good with that change. And the wide open throttle advance for ACT, so that protection has not been removed. I like that. And your normal one, not under wide open throttle, that hasn't been removed. So I'm happy with all those. Yeah, so I don't see anything massively wrong here. This all looks about right to me. So that's good. We really just need to get some better data, and then we'll turn off that wide open throttle table. So looks good there. Pretty sure we checked it earlier, but I'm going to double check. Yeah, so we've plugged in your 408 cubic inches now. So that should keep us with more accurate load measurements. So I like that. Make sure this hasn't been tampered with. Okay, that's normal. Throttle position. This has not been tampered with. Now, another thing that we're definitely going to have to mess with is your transient fuel. And again, we're kind of really starting from scratch on this tune, so we're not ready to mess with that yet. We need to get the basics. Just get it to idle, make sure we've got good injector slopes, good math data, and then once we kind of get through some iterations there, this will be another thing. So really a couple big areas to kind of wrap up this video that I want to look at in a future revision. Number one, we need to look at your wide open throttle timing, and then also probably just the timing table in general, because other than wide open throttle, it's all been left alone. I want to make sure that your fueling is, that we're getting what we want and that we're happy there. And what I ultimately suspect we're going to do is go into this base open loop table and lean this out, but we need to make sure that your transfer's right. And since we're totally going in blind right now, I'd pretty much guarantee you it's not right at the moment. So we're going to need to spend some time in here, but let's get the fuel right first. And then we're going to have to work on your idle. I am willing to bet that this car's not idling well right now, just because of how things were set up. So we're going to have to go through some logging where we look at your idle air valve's duty cycle, really get a better feel for how much idle air your engine needs to maintain RPMs, get some of that stuff plugged in, maybe make some minor adjustments on your throttle body's set screw, and then we can really focus on those transients. So, man, Jonathan, I appreciate you sending this to me. I think we're probably going to have at least one, maybe two more videos around your build. So, but this is off to a much better start. So I'll get this thing saved, get it over to you, and we'll go from there, man. Appreciate you. Guys, good luck. Godspeed.